For joining us this evening. Karen Greenberg is the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham Law. She has a number of books, really significant books that help chart sort of key moments in the post 9/11 era. Rogue Justice, The Making of the Security State, The Least Worst Place, Guantanamo's First 100 Days, which was selected by as one of the best books by the Washington Post, as well as by Slate.com. She's the editor of a number of important books, including The Enemy Combatant Papers, American Justice, The Courts and the War on Terror, The Torture Papers, The Road to Abu Ghraib. She's something you should all know is that she's the editor-in-chief of the Sufan Group Morning Brief. So if you're interested in national security issues, you can sign up to the Morning Brief, and you'll receive each morning a very well curated overview of key national security issues. And Karen's been doing this for a while, and it's a great resource. I read it every day. And today we're thrilled to have Karen with us today to talk about her new book, which is called Subtle Tools: The Dismantling of American Democracy from the War on Terror to Donald Trump. And this was featured in a full-page spread in the Outlook section of this last Sunday's Washington Post. And we welcome you, Karen, to the Center on the Future of War community. And just for everybody to know, those of you who are new to our speaker series, our speaker, Karen Greenberg, will speak for a period of time about her book, about the issues covered in her book, and then we'll be open to a Q&A session. So there's a Q&A box in Zoom, and you just type your questions in. We will try to get to all the questions that are placed into the Q&A section. Thanks again for joining us, Karen. Thanks for all of you for spending some time with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you for making me part of this series. I really appreciate it. I want to talk today about the new book I've written called Subtle Tools. And I want to begin by telling you what actually subtle tools mean, and then I will, tell you about the contents of the book. But the idea behind this project was that for all of the policies, those which we like, those which we may not like, of the war on terror that I and others have written about, there's something else we need to pay attention to. And that is the way in which those policies were brought about. And so my premise is that while we can sunset certain policies, why we can discredit certain policies, why we can move on from them, until we deal with the tools that enabled them to come about, we have a situation where the democracy itself is challenged, and they can be utilized as they were, for example, by the former president in ways that really violate much of what we think about American democracy, the rule of law, and our customary norms. And in general, they compromise the culture of governance in America. And that's what I argue. And so the book begins with the war on terror, with 9/11. And it ends with the insurrection, with the Capitol riots, essentially, and talks maybe about the first iterations of the Biden presidency just as an afterwards. And so I wanted to walk you today through some of these tools and then tie them to different presidents. And then I'm really looking forward to the discussion at the end. The first of the subtle tools that I talk about, and one which basically has its imprint on all the others, is the abuse and degradation of language. And in particular, the use of language in a way that is decidedly and intentionally imprecise for the purpose of expanding the powers of the president and the executive, and to such a point where the laws themselves can become compromised. And so I begin the book with the authorization for the use of military force for 2001. I call this the document in the war on terror, because I think it really sets the tone for the use of imprecision and vagueness to allow such expanded powers for such a long period of time, now 2 decades. The authorization for the use of military force, which was passed in 2001, is remarkably and irresponsibly, I would say, imprecise. Although it was used as the means and the authorization to go into war in Afghanistan, to defeat al-Qaeda, to find bin Laden, to respond to the attacks of 9/11, the language did not convey its purpose. The language of the AUMF of 2001 was incredibly vague. The enemy was not named. The country was not named. The geographical region was not named. There was no allusion to the temporal framework or the end of hostilities or what would constitute the end of hostilities. And just so you know how unusual this was, this really stands in contradistinction to what are customary authorizations for force that had been used prior to this in American history, and also for declarations of war. That imprecision was not unknowing. It was decidedly, we don't know exactly what we're going to want to use this for. This is an opportunity to get past something as broad as it can be passed. And there were individuals who warned against this, many actually, including Barbara Lee. And so this authorization is still with us to this day. And as I'm sure many of you who are listening to this know, it's been used in countries all over the world. I think the last count that was taken maybe was 2019, where 18 countries had been cited under the authorization of use of military force for the use of force by the United States. And at first it was troops on the ground, but then it was other things, including, for example, as you know, the use of targeted killings, which expanded under the aegis of the Obama administration. And I argue that this kind of imprecision of language, this abuse of language, this degradation of language is present throughout much of the architecture of the war on terror. And so a second tool, and I will get into other language examples as we go forward, because I want to bring this into the Trump era, but just perhaps the most noteworthy abuse of language under the Obama administration was the use of the word imminence, which I think many of us have written about. But the use of the word imminence to justify using a targeted strike against an individual, most famously against Anwar al-Awlaki, American citizen, jihadist, targeted abroad. And the word imminence was used to conceptually frame the idea of someone who was known to pose a threat, to want to pose a violence against the United States, who the security establishment thought had the means and wherewithal to do it, and therefore was posed an imminent danger, as opposed to imminence for a specific set of occurrences that were about to occur that would damage a specific place or harm specific populations or individuals. So it was something that, in between the authorization for the use of military force and the use of the word imminence by Obama, there were many, many other iterations of this, which we can talk about. I will just say that because we're here in the context of the Future of War program, I wanted to focus on these two. The second tool that I want to talk about and bring this imprecision to bear is the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which was created with the mission of bringing together the forces that could counter terrorism in the homeland, for the homeland, to make the country safe. The idea that the United States had not been able to mount ahead of time the kind of force that it needed, the kind of deterrence to this attack, was approached on a number of levels. And one way was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. And so you saw agencies, departments, offices from across the executive, some of them even new, brought into this new department. And they included offices from Justice, from the Department of Defense, from Health and Human Services, from Agriculture. And it gives you a sense of the combination of things that were going to go into this agency. And from the start, that was, on one level, a problem. The problem being, what was the mission for all of these agencies and departments that had their own mission to begin with? How were they all going to fit together? And what was the chain of command, so to speak, going to be for deciding how to take coordinated action or not? And in a way, it is the physical representation of the kind of imprecision that was launched with the AUMF and other policies in the fall of 2001, right after 9/11. I call what was made out of the Department of Homeland Security a kind of bureaucratic porousness where offices could trade what they were doing, it was so unclear about mission. And we saw this most dramatically and profoundly early on in the 2000 aughts in the response to Hurricane Katrina, where just what authority the Coast Guard had, who could give the authorization for the Coast Guard for a part of Homeland Security, where the state apparatus fit in vis-a-vis the response versus the federal response, which offices were supposed to respond and who was supposed to tell them which response, would it be the Department of Homeland Security secretary or someone else, became incredibly confused. And it was a failure of the agency to perform in a way that to do what it needed to do. The interesting thing, and it costs lives, the interesting thing to be noted about the creation of the Department of Homeland Security is in part what was left out. Because although it was framed to be the lead counterterrorism agency in the country, it in fact did not include the FBI. The FBI was the lead agency in the country for finding, deterring, investigating, and countering terrorism at the time. So at the beginning, there was sort of a set of questions about what Department of Homeland Security was about. And there were some that noticed this, notably Russ Feingold, who was quite worried that there would be such a confusion of authorities and missions and principles that it could be a dysfunctional agency. What in fact happened was that it pivoted very quickly to drug crimes, which are mentioned, by the way, in the act setting up Homeland Security. And now we've seen it recently in the border. And if I have time, I'll talk about the pivot of Homeland Security to the border. Today, the Department of Homeland Security is the largest agency, law enforcement agency in the country. Another aspect of bureaucratic porousness that sort of follows on the heels of that, but it is characteristic of the United States after the war on terror, is the way in which executive departments interacted with one another. For example, the lack of a sense of independence between the White House and the DOJ, which became profound in the war on terror and even more problematic during the Trump years. And we can talk about that as well. But it was also between the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, and I'm just picking some examples, where the lines of boundaries for authorities lay, where the mission actually lay, was confused. And in that confusion, new authorities came about, and particularly at the border as Homeland Security turns its attention to the immigrants and the migrant crisis. A third tool, and let me just add about bureaucratic porousness, something I want to talk about, which is that it has a future in the Trump administration that I'm going to come back to, that is quite significant, and in some ways something we really need to think about as a country, and that is, what are Department of Homeland Security agents able to be trained for and used for? And while that was never clarified in the original legislation, it had problems down the line, which I will come back to. A third component, a third subtle tool, and this is one that won't surprise you, but it was subtle in the way it was used, just by definition, is secrecy. I mean, we all know the story of how secret memos were generated from the Department of Justice to justify and recategorize as legal the use of cruel and inhumane treatment and torture. In the enhanced interrogation memos or the torture memos, which were written by the Office of Legal Counsel, torture was approved, the White House approved it, and the CIA implemented it at black sites around the globe. But that was not the only piece of secrecy that took place during the war on terror. The surveillance policies that were launched under the auspices of the Patriot Act and later elsewhere were kept from not just the American public, as with torture, also kept from other players within the executive itself, and also kept away from, to a large extent, the courts and Congress. So the way in which secrecy was created and implemented and relied upon in the war on terror, as we will see, had profound significance for today's world. When President Obama came into office, one of the first things he did was to issue a memoranda saying that he was committed to transparency, his administration was committed to transparency, and the actual implementation of transparent mechanisms did not seem to follow. Instead, there was a sense that a government that behaved well and respected transparency could be transformative. And the fact is that while the tools of secrecy lie on the table and are not addressed, you see them rear their head again, as we did in the last 4 years. And then the final tool that I talk about, and it's one that is infused by all the others, but I thought really stands on its own, is the willingness to abandon laws and norms. And that willingness, which reared its head very early on in the war on terror, of not having to abide by the limit of the law, of being willing to be imprecise, of this bureaucratic imprecision, and of a calculated and overabundant use of secrecy, was really premised on the idea that laws and norms in certain circumstances, and particularly in national security circumstances, did not matter anymore. So setting up Guantanamo Bay as an alternate system for detaining and trying those in the war on terror, but not having it accord with international law, with domestic law, or with the Uniform Code of Military Justice, was a way of saying, we're going to abandon these norms. And because so little of this was redressed in any way, that became a fourth tool in and of itself. So the book begins by explaining these four tools and showing how they played out in sort of summary fashion in the war on terror. But much of the book, more than half of the book, focuses on the Trump years and talks about how the Trump administration took many of these tools and repurpose them and turn them not on enemies abroad, not on jihadist terrorists, but at home on one another. And so there are many ways in which the abuse of language reared its head during the Trump administration, and which imprecision of terms reared its head. And so I just thought I would mention one, and then we can come back to it. But one for sure was the erasure of the boundary between criminal immigrants and non-criminal immigrants. That all of a sudden you had a large category. To be an undocumented immigrant was to be a criminal, not just to be facing criminal charges. And so once you have changed that dynamic, you change the laws, the norms, the policies that apply to immigrants. And we saw the result of that. Another thing that, and I want to stay within my time frame here, but another thing that the Trump administration took to new levels was secrecy. It's one thing to wrap yourself in secrecy and say, this is what you need to keep the country safe. But Donald Trump, who definitely valued secrecy, took it to a new level by that his predecessors had embraced secrecy. There's no question that both presidents before him thought it was an important and effective tool, is particularly in national security, which they defined in very broad terms. Donald Trump understood that the most important thing about secrecy would be not to create the record. If you really want secrecy, what you need is the absence of facts. The absence of facts that exist in documents. And so you saw this at meetings with foreign officials where notes were not allowed to be taken, as John Bolton and others have written about. You saw this at the border where families and children were separated from each other, but no records were kept of it in many cases. And therefore the documentary record, the reunification was not possible. And you saw this continually in the way in which Donald Trump refused to use language that was specific, but used language that was broad and all-encompassing and suggestive. And he elided the distinction between secrecy and lying, because if you don't have to be beholden to facts, then you really don't have to be beholden to facts in terms of what you say, not just in what is brought up against you. And we see this refusal to want to release information has been a profound part of the Trump administration, but it's certainly not new with him. Look what it's taken to get even a minimal part of the torture report able for public view. You had a torture report, 6,700 pages worth, and the public has seen less than 600 pages of it, I think. When we will ever see the other 6,700 pages of what was done in the name of Americans, we won't know. So it is not new with Trump, but it's still here, even though the policies and the practices associated with at the beginning are not there. And in terms of bureaucratic porousness, just to pick an example, because it's the most efficient way to do it, you saw this, you actually saw all of the tools converge in a very impactful way in the response to the Black Lives Matter protest. And there's a chapter in the book that goes into a deep dive on Portland and what happened in Portland as a way of looking at some of the ways in which the subtle tools came together as a legacy from the war on terror years. Because what happened in Portland was you saw DHS agents who had been at the border redeployed to Portland, showing up without any notice, showing up without any identification. So in other words, if you want to call that secrecy, if you want to call that imprecision, the point is that they did not identify by their uniforms. They did not identify by any name tag. They were just there at the behest of the White House to take care of the protests. And their mission was a very amorphous one, that encountering the protests, what they were doing was protecting federal buildings. And where the line between the federal buildings and the end of that territory lay was completely imprecise, and nobody made an attempt really to make it precise. And I just think that Portland, about which I probably could have written a whole book, exemplified so much of what happened in the war on terror, with the bait and switch from the Department of Homeland Security, the imprecision of language, the secrecy about who was doing what, in whose name, where and why, except it was all here. It was all at home. And so I spend a lot of time talking about that. I also take the idea of the subtle tools to some of the more traditional war on terror space, which I think is an interesting part of the discussion, and we shouldn't forget it. One is to the Muslim ban, which showed the same sense of imprecision, vagueness, and breadth of application that the country had gotten used to in its authorities abroad in the name of the war on terror. And we also saw it in the killing of General Soleimani, where some very interesting things happened in terms of procedure, laws, norms, imprecision, etc. And I'll just name a few, which were that the Trump White House and the Trump National Security Council didn't really have its act together after the Soleimani killing on what authorized the administration to carry it out. So you saw different narratives coming out of different officials, and I talk about this in the book, some saying it was commander-in-chief powers, some saying it was the authorization for the use of force for 2002 for Iraq, some making up a mixture of the two, some sort of backing away from it, not really knowing. It's an indication of the lack of procedure that took place in making the decision itself, that the way in which a National Security Council and a presidency functions is by vetting things in a large setting in which as many voices as need to be at the table were there. This kind of process seems to have been bypassed in the Soleimani decision, and you can see it in that aftermath of not knowing what was relied on. The other thing was the use of the term imminent, taking it even further and codifying it in a way as if premised upon how Obama had used it, and also the use of the term assassination and saying that this wasn't an assassination. And so the bottom line was, once you put these things out there, they can be abused. And what the book really speaks to is how much this country needs to think, not just about the policies and not just about the subtle tools, but it's really a plea for accountability. And it doesn't have to even be punitive accountability, but it has to be not being afraid of putting the facts out there and what was compromised, what went wrong, what abrogated laws and norms, and how did that happen, so that and putting in prescriptive measures for making sure this can't happen again. And so that's what the book sort of comes to at the end, and sort of assesses the very first, weeks of Biden. After that, and I can talk more about Biden if you want to, in the Q&A. But I think I've come to the end, I think, of my time that I was allotted. So I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was a great presentation. There's so many rich ideas and issues that come out of your book and your presentation. But at the core of it seems to be this issue of what guides practice. And one of the issues you talk about is sort of the erosion of norms.
Yeah.
But what do you do if norms erode? And with the erosion of norms by government officials and others, it turns out to be valuable and useful for certain ends. What can you do to reestablish norms? Since what upholds norms is just that people agree jointly to uphold them. They're not enshrined in laws necessarily.
That's super scary. I mean, that's really the crux of it. It's interesting watching the Biden administration, because I do think that Biden has a sense of this. I mean, every time he would say, let me be clear, I'd be like, okay, well, that's the opposite of imprecision, right? So the question is, what can be done? One of the things that Attorney General Merrick Garland did was to issue early this summer, a statement about the necessary separation between the Department of Justice and the White House, that there has to be a sense of independence. That's an attempt to reestablish a norm. Whether or not, there is enough in there that actually creates that separation and that independence remains to be seen. But the first thing it has to do is to clarify what the norm is. And I think that Garland tried to do that with that memorandum. That needs to happen across the board. And the real problem is, when you talk about Department of Homeland Security, there is no norm, right? To get to your point, what would be the norm of how the Department of Homeland Security should function in a viable way? Now, what's interesting is that when the Department of Homeland Security used its powers to go against the Black Lives Matter protest, Michael Chertoff, who had been head of the Department of Homeland Security, and others, a whole cadre of individuals that had witnessed and helped with the creation of Homeland Security and its reforms, even after Katrina, weighed in on how this was an abuse of the Department of Homeland Security. So maybe getting inside, rethinking the conversation. What actually is the Department of Homeland Security? How should it function? We really need to talk about this, even though it's long overdue, would be another way of clarifying it. So it's not going to be easy, but the first thing you have to do is acknowledge that it needs to be done. In some ways, I mean, Obama's kind of take on it was, if you just behave well, you can reestablish norms. It didn't work out. That's not right. Not that he was able to reestablish norms anyway by just behavior, but the legacy of it, there are no legs to that. And so we know it doesn't work. And the question is, what works is you have to name what the norms are, at least for starters. And you have to consider sanctioning, punishing, calling out those who so willingly, brazenly, and abusively violated the norms.
A question here from Samira Hussein. Can all these tools be classified as justification after the fact? If so, is this a fundamental flaw in policies or a lack of independence among the different checks and balances that supposedly exist?
That's a good question. It's complicated, but it gets at something that I really think needs to be talked about, which is the biggest the biggest norm that was violated, starting with the war on terror and going forward. And this goes, of course, with presidential powers and the unitary executive, was the absolute disruption of checks and balances. The way in which so I don't know that it's just an after the fact, but what happened during the fact was that courts were convinced to say, not us. This is a national security issue. Don't count on us. And Congress was willing to say, you don't need to come to us for every single military act you want to take. Here's the authorization for the use of military force, to go back to that example. Here's the Patriot Act. You don't have, we have broad authorizing powers here. We're giving them to you. You use them, the executive. And so the willingness to give up the checks and balances actually played out, as you saw this during the Trump administration, when a number of courts tried to intervene, for example, in the Muslim ban, right? and the tension that went on between the Department of Justice, Solicitor General, the executive, and the lower courts. And what you saw there was an attempt of these institutions to try to resurrect their part in the governing structures of the country. And although it was very painful, it was at least a try to name what had happened and to move beyond it.
Here's a rather long but interesting question from Wes Anthony. You have stated that the abuse and degradation of language has been one of the most effective and destructive subtle tools used by the government during the war on terror. Can you cite specific instances where a president, not Trump, was recorded as having done this on purpose? My main concern as a military officer who works within the intelligence community is that the extreme size and complicated nature of our bureaucracy is often overburdened with jargon that makes it difficult for people working in the same departments to communicate. Was the lack of precision in communication explicitly intended, or perhaps a symptom of the overextended political system? Not that this excuses our executives' behavior, but I'm just curious.
That is a great question. So let me take a stab at it, okay? Which is that there were some people that intended it. I actually think that many of the lawyers who worked on this, whether it was, drafting memos or drafting authorizations, know the difference between precise language and imprecise language, know the dangers of vagueness. We have a legal standard, void for vagueness. If something is too vague, how can you apply the law in a way that resembles justice? But I do think the growth of bureaucracies and the differences between departments and that part of it may be an unintentional consequence of what happens when you do grow the bureaucracy like that. But it's also, look, you got to put in the effort. Yes, different professions speak different languages, right? Yes, different departments have different words they use to express certain things. No, you have to. This is the point of having meetings with each other, right? What do we mean by the following thing? What do we mean by, zero tolerance, right? To give an example, right? What does that actually mean? What are the parameters of it? And that, to me, is something that public officials need to do. And let me just take this a little bit further, which is that we saw in a number of cases, and we still see it to this day, of big policy issues. We've seen a situation where you sometimes get the sense, and I think this question really brings us to the fore, you get the sense that when things are too complicated, let's just move on to something else, all right? And the most grotesque sense of this is Guantanamo. Not that people haven't tried, but the complexities of emptying Guantanamo, of closing it, of dealing with the politics, of dealing with the military commission, I could go on and on, right? It's such a complicated mess that how do you begin to go forward? And there has been some headway made in each administration about things on Guantanamo, but this notion that things can be too complicated, I can't tell you the answer to it, but first you have to say, there's a tendency when things get too complicated or too bureaucratic to get confused, and that's not okay. Therefore, we have to introduce into our policymaking, decision-making, meeting structure, a sense of understanding that we're all on the same page. Because if we're not on the same page, two people, then intentionality can come in. I know he means that, but I mean something else. I'm going to do it my way. He's going to do it his way. So it's not okay. It's not a responsible way to create, sustain, and give a future to this culture of governance.
So building on what you just said, the AUMF, the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, the initial one in particular, seems especially salient. Some questions for you. When the AUMF was initially drafted in a sort of emergency condition, a situation of great uncertainty, do you think that Congress had any idea it would still be operating so many years later? And second, what do you think explains why all of these members of Congress have just been unable for so long to be able to substantively address something that clearly is enormously broad and really it's just not applicable to many of the circumstances in which it's used?
So Congress really gave up its powers with the AUMF, as you're alluding to, and as the book talks about. For the life of me, really think, I don't know if it's just, it's staggering that they would want to sign on to something like that and not have a say, given the fact that they are given the power to declare war, right? And so I think one of the reasons is it's just too useful. And it's too useful for the presidents who wield the political power. That's one reason. The other reason is the American public. The American public's appetite for war powers, there was no real backlash to the way this was being used. I mean, yes, there were a number of us and civil liberties advocates and constitutional scholars who talked about it, but for the most part, there wasn't enough of a public dismay about how it was being used. So why should Congress get into that and mess that up? So I think it's a combination of, the politics of Washington and the politics of speaking to the country itself. But I do think that this idea of that we're always at war is problematic. And you've seen that we're out of Afghanistan, but we are not out of the 2001 authorization for the use of military force. And that is a profound fact. And you can spin it a lot of different ways. Well, we still might need it for overflies. We don't. You can go to Congress and get certain authorizations. And for the life of me, I don't understand why Congress, not to be lawful, not to be normalized, not for any of those reasons, doesn't want more of a say in where, how, and when its forces are used.
Well, there certainly doesn't seem to have been any cost to those in Congress to have not acted on this. And so one of the questions is, what if there's no cost to failing to, follow what the Constitution seems to be clear about, then why take the risk of going out on a limb on something that might later, you might be held accountable to, since it was created so long ago?
Well, one reason might be to keep the country safe, because, I'm just playing devil's advocate, but if Congress does not have the sufficient power to curtail the use of force abroad, then how vulnerable is the country? And so, but yes, this comes back to the point about, the word accountability. How do we hold officials accountable, not for what they do in their personal lives, but for what they're charged with, and for being negligent about upholding the offices they hold. And it's not on the table. And so, what I was trying to say was, can we please put these things on the table and make it so that, and this is how do you do this? But there have to be more, to pick a bad word, regulations about what the requirements of laws that are passed are, or else what do we have? Do we have just an ad hoc system that we pick and choose from at will, depending on what the executive or stronger rather than weaker members of Congress want?
So in that sense, is the erosion of norms as the answer to that, greater and clearer regulations to provide teeth to some of these things that previously were norms?
Yeah, you have to name. So just for example, to give you an example of how this can get out of hand, the killing of Qasem Soleimani, right? The Iranian general, was done, some would say, under the authorization for 2002, but it was done within the sense of a person who was known for targeting through proxy means for getting terrorist groups to attack American targets and American allies' targets, okay? But the mindset of doing that was aimed at non-state actors, right? The idea was the change in so many of these norms about the use of force had to do with non-state actors. But Qasem Soleimani was not a non-state actor. He was a top official within the Iranian government. And so what the authorization, the way in which this was done, the idea that you don't have to go to Congress, you can just do these things, authorize this, and we'll figure out afterwards how, was to make that leap from non-state actor to state actor, which I would submit is an incredibly dangerous line to have stepped over. So yes, there needs to be teeth about the specifics of what authorizations can be used for. And there was just no appetite to do that after 9/11. And more importantly, to your point, there could have been a reset 18 months later. There could have been a reset 5 years later. There was no reset. And so now the question becomes, why should we have a reset? It worked. It got us this far. I think that's kind of how the mentality of it. And that's just, I think, inappropriate and dangerous.
So, a question here, since these tools can and were used to erode democracy internally, which tool do you consider the most dangerous for Americans vis-a-vis civil liberties?
I would say that there's one that goes across all of them, and that is imprecision. And that I should have named the book. There was another possible, just call the whole thing. And that, so I would say language is the most dangerous, but they all abet it. And the reason I say language is that you need to know what the crime you're being accused of. Let's say that, you're a person who's spouting some kind of terrorist rhetoric in the international sense or the domestic sense. What are you allowed to say and what are you not allowed to say? How do we know your intentions? How do we not know your intentions? Or is it just vague and the government can make it up as it goes along? And on the other side of that, in terms of civil liberties, what is the government allowed to do in terms of surveillance? How does it define its words in terms of its investigative capacities? So I would say it this way, that in the stark reality of realpolitik, secrecy is the worst, because having surveillance powers that we don't know about and being targeted in that way, investigated in that way, is such an erosion of the Fourth Amendment. And I actually think the Fourth Amendment suffered greatly in the wake of the war on terror. But in terms of the overall aspect of what changed and how insecure you can be in your life, I think imprecision of language. We need to know what world we're in, what our words mean, what authorities can be used against us. And if it's vague, how do you respond? How do you live your life? How do you, interact?
You just mentioned something that's quite key to these last 20 years, which is during this period of time, there's been a radical transformation of the ways in which technologies, just ordinary technologies, not only military and intelligence technologies, but ordinary technologies allow for extraordinary surveillance, supervision, all kinds of actions that really were not part of our lives at 9/11, when this sort of the start of your accounts. So how does that play into what you're discussing? Does that present greater dangers, or what do you see the trends moving forward?
Well, that's sort of where we are now as a country, which is, it's not just the authorities for collecting things that you have to worry about. It's what's done with the collection, right? And who has access to the collection, and which parts of the bureaucracy have access to the collection. Can it be cabined? How can it be cabined? And who can pay attention to whether or not the rules are being followed, and who's making the rules? And we as a society have not figured this out yet. When you hear Washington talk about, we need a public-private partnership to decide what we're going to do with data collection, what we're going to do with data investigation, who's going to need a subpoena or who's authorized to have a subpoena to go at it. What happens when this is abused by a private company? Let's forget the government for now. What happens when it's abused? Where are the regulations that are in place for this? We don't have them yet. And so I see this as we all know this, meaning we American citizens know this. We're still in the Wild West very much when it comes to not just cybersecurity, but protections in the cyber realm. And so I think this is, yes, one of the many things the country has to deal with quickly. Yeah.
So this appears like a sort of unrelentingly pessimistic account of the last 20 years. So within this context, are there kernels of positivity or benefits, both on the security side, but also on the sort of support for the U.S. as a democratic society that are woven into into the post 9/11 era?
I feel bad that it's relentlessly pessimistic or whatever you said, but are there, okay, so here's what I would say. I would say yes. For one thing, And I think the younger generation is really very savvy about a lot of the complexities that I talk about. And by younger, I mean just not, kind of the people, the younger 40-year-olds that are now being in the administration. I think they're more comfortable with some of these complexities than the rest of us are, that my age is, for example, particularly, but not only in the spheres that are impacted by technology. I think that comfort with technology, whether it's on the internet, with drone warfare, or with cryptocurrency, for example, whether it's any of those things, is going to be, it is a shining light going forward in terms of understanding how to deal with it. They're not going from the 20th century to the 21st century. They are 21st century policymakers, and I think it makes a huge difference. I think that too will clarify many of the terms. For example, the term war. If you talk to cyber professionals about war, and this is in your field, so you should talk about this more, but where is the line between war and conflict when it comes to cyber issues? All of these issues about rethinking war and rethinking peace and what it looks like and what's sustainable and what isn't sustainable are all suggest and require policy determinations and laws. And so I think we're moving towards that as that conversation happens. So it's not just 9/11, it's 9/11, as you suggest, and the technology that made so much of what I talk about possible in a larger way.
A question here from Abdulaziz Waheli. With the absence of courts as checks and balances and the erosion of established norms, where do we go from here, given the current polarization of the country? And knowing that even the norms that used to exist among, say, members of Congress to produce legislation are now all gone.
We have to be nicer to each other. And I don't mean like kinder. I mean, we all demonize each other. I don't think anybody's guilt-free of this. And there is something to be said for sitting down at the table and actually talking to individuals, maybe not the senators, but their staffs talking to each other, which I know they do. But I have another thought on this as well, which I've been thinking about a lot lately. It's not in the book, although Portland might suggest some of this, which is that I think that there are some interesting things that have gone on during COVID at the local level that haven't really been brought to the surface yet, about individuals who are the mayors of small towns or town supervisors who have had to deal with a lot of issues that are related to mask mandates, that are related to school openings, that have made it so that they've had to negotiate language and negotiate conversation between people who fundamentally disagree, but those little societies have to function. They have to go to school, the parents have to go to work, they have to figure it out. And there are some who have figured it out, and it hasn't been fun, but it's very interesting to some of the stories that I've heard, to watch how these people have come to respect one another, even if they don't respect one another's opinions, if you can make such a distinction. So I actually think some of the future is going to have to come from the ground up in terms of constructive civic engagement and resolution, rather than from the top down. And while I know that's a little different than what I write about in the book, it's just sort of become more and more apparent to me. And I think it's doable. And I think it just has to be put in a context where it can be emphasized. And so I think that's also a way forward.
Why do you think that there were so few ground up protests related to the still termed longest wars of the post 9/11 era, given all the kind of rich reporting on various abuses and excesses, and even now, as with the kind of the formal end of the Afghan conflict, at least in one sense? Why so little interest and engagement, at least in the sort of politicized sense, within the United States?
Because President Bush and President Obama made it clear. And as President Bush said, in his earliest iterations of the war, we're taking the war over there. We are taking the war over there. It is not going to be here. And we did. And that was the idea. And the same thing with Guantanamo. We're going to put it outside of ourselves. This is not coming here. That was kind of the sense. And it kind of worked all the way down to the level you're talking about. Now, that's one of the things, and you and I had talked about this before, that I think is so fascinating about the number of interpersonal relationships based on incredible attachment and emotions between individuals in the United States from a variety of sectors, whether it's journalism or the military or the NGOs, their attachment to and compassion for Afghans, many of whom they knew, and to caring about them, their families, and their futures. And that's a way in which saying, you know what, it wasn't so over there as we thought about, even if the political environment and the political conversation was able to make it, off limits for that. So that's another reason. The other reason is that, in wars, you have a war tax, you have a draft, right? This was a war that happened without that in your face war, accoutrements that we are accustomed to in other wars. So I think that's also a reason.
So could you say a little bit more about your perspective? I realize it's not part of the book, but your perspective on the significance of so many Americans' engagement with Afghans and all of these often private efforts to help Afghans leave the country and to help them resettle, et cetera. I mean, what does that say about the country, democracy, or any of these themes that are picked up in your many years of work, actually?
Well, if you want to think of it in very optimistically, as I do, it tells you that othering can't survive actually knowing people. And that while you can try to make it so that, well, those people over there and that doesn't affect us, and et cetera, it doesn't work once you actually interact with the human beings that this is impacting, that this is about, that are being, drawn for us in a variety of political discussions and sometimes in journalism. And the fact is that knowing other human beings interpersonally changes the tenor of the relationship, and it changes the political environment as well, which is what you're seeing, this refusal to just let Afghans, suffer from the kinds of things they could be suffering from, to the extent that Americans and others can help. And I think that's a very important moment, and it should be recognized. And I'm sure it's not just true just in Afghanistan, but that's 20 years of being in a country. You can't just pull out. It's not just any place with any amount of people that are interchangeable with other people. It's real, and it has to do with our global world. And I mean, that's another part of this that I think it suggests, which is that as much as we've learned the lessons of how global we are from the war on terror, from COVID, from what we're hearing about climate change, the fact is that this globalization does not discount how personal some of this is. And the reason this is important and is a sign of light is that, the world now has 82.5 million displaced persons and refugees, which is a vast number of stateless or individuals. And this is going to be a question that is going to be it's going to be dealt with personally, not just in the mega political world. And so I see what's going on in Afghanistan now, even though it's separate from that issue, as opening up a conversation that we very much need to have as a globe.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think now, reflecting on these 9/11, the post 9/11 era, where are we now in terms of the likelihood, possibility, fears of another moment of a great U.S. investment in foreign conflicts? Is that imminent? Is it unlikely? Are there lessons from the past 20 years that tend take us one direction or the other?
I think the appetite for conflict at the political level is high. That, you can't open a newspaper without hearing somebody talking about China and the perils that lie ahead. You hear a lot of drum beating about it. On the other hand, I think that, so I don't think there's an exhaustion about war, but I do think there's I think there's a recognition that the need to recognize humanity, is something that needs to be happening, not just because it's the right moral thing to do, but also because this is what the future is going to bring. And I think that the more the world, I think the fear of destabilization is an important one and can counter some of this drive towards conflict. And that what we've seen with COVID, what we've seen with refugees, what we understand is coming with climate change is that destabilization is going to be everywhere. And the idea of trying to fight a war that depends on a certain kind of stability and focus is not really there. And so, and the way it used to be. And so, but this I leave to you and to your Future of War project to address.
Well, but woven into this might be not just the term war, but to what degree does this take us to, the broader term of security and maybe a need for a different vision of security, because the post 9/11 era and much of what you talk about shows our society, the US, just domestically being forced to reckon with a quite aggressive understanding of security, a counterterrorism vision, and all that it implies. Is there a need for a new understanding of security to maybe help revitalize democracy in the US, and what might that look like?
Yeah, well, for one thing, yes, and that was true 20 years ago. That the transformation of the term security happened very quickly. But one thing we need to add to security is two other things. One is safety. I always was struck by the fact that where was the term safety in all of this? What is it? What does it mean to feel safe? Is it really to feel safe from a foreign power? How do you feel safe in your community, in your school, in your home? Safety is one part of this, and I mean that in a lot of different ways, just not just physical safety, but an environment you can trust. But I also think security has to rely on feeling like you know what's coming next, meaning, and in the good way, right? You know that there are certain things that you can rely on, that elections are going to take place, to pick one, right? That your health system is going to be there for you when you need it. And therefore, the issues that come up that have to do with infrastructure, that have to do with sort of taking care of people in ways that they're taken care of in countries around the world, are as much about security as anything else. That security is a very personal feeling, not just the national feeling that it was, shoved into after 9/11 and for so many years.
Is it possible to mobilize the country to embrace that vision of security, and what would it take to make that happen? Surely COVID didn't produce that.
No, 100%, because what people need to, once people feel better in their own lives, they will be able to feel better for other people's lives. And this idea that everybody lives on the edge, that you don't know what's going to disappear from your life. And I'm not talking about foreign conflict. I'm talking about sustenance, jobs, where you live, and your physical safety on the streets. I think that is when you provide some of that, a lot of the anxiety and anger and distrust will go away, providing some breathing space for beginning to think constructively about how to sustain life in the country in a way that is fair and just and cares about the people who live in the country and not just about foreign conflict.
So that might actually be the recipe for, one idea of how to resolve some of the key issues that you document that are so troubling in the book. What's your next book going to be?
I don't know. What should my next book be?
Maybe about why Americans care so much about Afghans fleeing the situation as it stands.
Well, whatever my next book is, I think it probably will be about individual people that have been affected by some of these things. Yeah. Well, thank you for the idea, though.
Well, thanks so much. Thank you so much for spending part of your evening. It's quite a bit later there in New York. And thanks everybody who's joined us this evening. We have a few more events coming up. This Thursday from 12 to 1, we have an Emerging Technology and Security Roundtable with three of our ASU faculty, Annika Benedict, Robert Schmidl, and Peter Singer. That's from 12 to 1. And if you're on our mailing list, you'll hear all about this. And then on this coming Monday, October 25th, Cecilia Munoz will join us. She's a MacArthur Fellow and Senior Advisor at New America. She'll be speaking about her book, More Than Ready, Be Strong and Be You, Other Lessons for Women of Color on the Rise. And thank you all again, and have a great evening.